There is a strange discomfort that fills the air when someone stands before you with no mask, no performance, no hidden motive, only presence. It is the kind of silence that reveals rather than conceals. Most people are unprepared for that kind of truth. They are accustomed to reflections shaped by approval, by fear, by the endless need to belong. But when a person is truly present, something deeper happens. They stop being a participant in illusions and become a mirror that reflects life exactly as it is. For the narcissist, that kind of mirror is unbearable. They survive through distortion, through stories, projections, and performances that keep them at the center of every scene. Their sense of self is not rooted in truth, but in perception. They need to be seen, admired, or feared, for that gaze is what keeps their fragile identity intact. But the presence of a conscious soul does not provide that fuel. It reflects reality without decoration, and in that reflection, the narcissist begins to see what they have always run from, their own emptiness. A narcissist's world is built upon carefully constructed masks. Every compliment they give, every story they tell, every act of charm or superiority serves one purpose: to reinforce the illusion of significance. They do not relate, they perform. They do not love, they idealize and discard. Beneath the glittering surface lies a profound insecurity, a self that was never nurtured, never accepted, never allowed to exist authentically. So they wear a mask not out of vanity, but out of survival. Without it, they fear they would disappear. When a person of genuine presence enters their life, this equilibrium is threatened. Presence does not play along. It does not admire the mask, nor does it challenge it through anger. It simply sees, and to be seen without illusion is the deepest fear of anyone who has built their existence upon falsehood. The narcissist senses the danger immediately. They may accuse you of being cold, unfeeling, or arrogant, but what truly disturbs them is that you cannot be manipulated into reflection. You no longer mirror back their fantasy. Presence is like a clean mirror. It does not distort. But to the narcissist, clarity feels like exposure. They rely on others to provide emotional smoke and mirrors to reflect the version of themselves they wish to believe in. When you refuse to do so, when your silence becomes a mirror of truth, you become intolerable to them. They might lash out, withdraw, or attempt to provoke you into reaction, because reaction restores their sense of power. The more you stay centered, the more they unravel. To stand in presence before such a person requires immense inner strength. It is not an act of confrontation, but of stillness. You are not fighting their illusion, you are simply refusing to feed it. Your awareness becomes a quiet revolution. Every attempt they make to draw you into drama collapses in the face of your clarity. You begin to see their manipulation not as personal attacks, but as the desperate movements of a self that cannot exist without external validation. This is why presence becomes the ultimate mirror. It shows what cannot be seen otherwise. It exposes the artificial nature of the narcissist's self-concept. They have spent years mastering the art of camouflage, adjusting their personality to meet the expectations of others. But in the presence of authenticity, their mask no longer fits. It starts to crack under the weight of truth. They might accuse you of changing, but in reality, it is their illusion that can no longer survive the light you bring. The mirror without a mask is not judgmental. It does not seek to shame or destroy. It simply reveals. In that revelation, there is both discomfort and opportunity. For those capable of self-reflection, the mirror becomes a path to transformation. For the narcissist, however, it is often experienced as an existential threat. They would rather shatter the mirror than face what it shows. They withdraw, attack, or devalue you, because to acknowledge your presence would mean acknowledging their falsehood. Yet the power of presence lies precisely in its neutrality. It neither condemns nor condones. It observes, and observation is the first step to freedom. The narcissist's fear of presence reveals a universal truth about human nature. We all wear masks, but only those who dare to remove them can encounter reality as it is. When you stop performing, you no longer live through the eyes of others. You begin to experience life directly, without distortion. That authenticity becomes both your protection and your strength. The mirror without a mask teaches something profound about energy. Wherever attention flows, energy follows. Narcissists crave attention because it sustains their identity. But when you withdraw emotional energy and replace it with awareness, you change the dynamic completely. Awareness does not feed illusions, it exposes them. You no longer act as a participant in their theater, you become the observer, and in that observation, their entire performance loses meaning. Presence is not passive, it is a living force. It dissolves lies not through aggression, but through illumination. It says nothing, yet it speaks everything. It is the silence that cannot be manipulated, the gaze that cannot be deceived. Those who have learned to live in presence do not need to fight narcissists. They simply outgrow the environment where narcissism thrives. Their energy no longer resonates with deception, so deception falls away naturally. And this is why presence becomes their greatest fear. It reminds them of a self they have buried, a self that once felt, cared, and existed without masks. Presence stirs that forgotten memory, and with it, unbearable shame. It threatens the illusion of superiority and control. So they retreat, seeking the comfort of people who still wear masks, who still reflect the false light they need. But the one who embodies presence carries a power they cannot touch. Human relationships are built upon exchanges of energy, though few truly understand the depth of this invisible economy. Every glance, every word, every emotional reaction is a subtle transaction of attention. Where our attention goes, our energy follows. For those who have never learned to source power from within, attention becomes their primary currency. And for the narcissist, it is their lifeline, the source from which their fragile identity feeds. Attention, in its purest form, is neutral. It is the light of consciousness itself, the awareness that notices without judgment. But when that light becomes fixated, when it becomes hooked by fear, admiration, or resentment, it transforms into something else entirely: attachment. Narcissists instinctively sense this truth. They have an uncanny ability to manipulate attention, to draw it toward themselves like gravity, because they understand, even if unconsciously, that the one who controls attention controls emotion. This is why the narcissist thrives in the realm of drama, conflict, and admiration. Chaos becomes their stage, attention their sustenance. They provoke, charm, seduce, and wound in cycles, not because they seek truth, but because they seek energy. Each reaction you give, whether love or anger, feeds the illusion that they exist in power. They do not mind being hated as long as they remain the focus. To be ignored is to be erased. In their world, indifference is annihilation, but presence is a different frequency altogether. Where attention is outward and seeking, presence is inward and grounded. Attention says, I am watching you. Presence says, I am aware of myself. This shift, though subtle, is seismic in its effect. When you move from attention to presence, you reclaim your power. The narcissist hooks no longer find a place to anchor. Their chaos no longer seduces your energy because you are no longer orbiting them. You are rooted in yourself. The difference between attention and presence is the difference between reaction and awareness. Attention reacts, presence observes. Attention can be stolen, manipulated, or weaponized. Presence cannot. It is self-contained, silent, and complete. When you dwell in presence, you become untouchable, not because you resist the narcissist, but because their tactics find no foothold in your inner stillness. The very energy they depend on evaporates in your neutrality. To understand this is to understand liberation. Narcissists are not defeated by confrontation. They are dissolved by absence, not physical absence, but emotional non-participation. They expect to draw energy through the familiar dance of reaction. They seek your outrage, your confusion, your desire to explain or justify. These are their points of entry. When you stop giving attention, their influence collapses because they cannot sustain power without the energy you unconsciously provide. Presence is not withdrawal, it is mastery. It means you are no longer lost in the maze of someone else's emotional theater. You see their projections for what they are, attempts to provoke identity. When you stay present, you no longer defend yourself against false accusations because you understand they are not about you. You no longer chase validation because you are no longer trying to prove your reality to someone who thrives on distorting it. You no longer need to win because you realize there is nothing to win in a battle built on illusion. Attention feeds illusion. Presence exposes it. When you are fully present, manipulation becomes visible. You can sense the subtle shifts, the moments they bait with flattery, guilt, or victimhood. You no longer interpret these behaviors as emotional truths, but as strategies. This awareness transforms your energy from reactive to responsive. You act from clarity, not from the need to be understood. The narcissist cannot function in that space because their power depends on confusion. To live in presence is to live in truth. You begin to notice how often your energy has been entangled in seeking approval, in fixing others, in proving your worth. You start to see that attention, when misplaced, becomes a chain. Every moment spent analyzing, defending, or explaining to someone who refuses to see you is a moment drained from your own self-awareness. Narcissists sense this pattern in others. They exploit the natural human desire to be understood. But once you recognize that desire as a trap, the spell breaks. Presence liberates you from the endless need to be seen. When you stop depending on external validation, you begin to generate energy from within. You start to experience what real power feels like: quiet, stable, and self-sustaining. It is not the power to control others, but the power to remain unmoved by their chaos. You begin to sense that your worth is not tied to anyone's recognition. You no longer need to compete for space in their narrative because you are writing your own. In this state, your attention becomes conscious. You choose where to place it, rather than having it pulled by manipulation or emotion. This is the essence of sovereignty, the capacity to direct your awareness rather than be directed by others. Narcissists fear this level of self-possession because it renders them powerless. They cannot feed on someone who no longer reacts. They cannot control someone who no longer seeks approval. Attention creates dependency. Presence creates freedom. When you are trapped in attention, you are living through others, through their opinions, their moods, their perception of you. But when you live in presence, you are connected to something deeper, the quiet intelligence of your own consciousness. This is not arrogance, it is alignment. You begin to move through the world with a stillness that cannot be easily disturbed. Your boundaries become effortless because they are no longer enforced through anger, but sustained through awareness. Presence becomes the natural antidote to every form of manipulation. You no longer try to outthink the narcissist because you understand that their game exists on a mental and emotional plane designed to confuse. Presence removes you from that plane entirely. You stop playing. You stop performing. You simply exist in the clarity of your own awareness. That is why presence feels so threatening to those who rely on control. It ends the game without confrontation. There is a kind of rebellion that makes no noise, no declarations, and no visible struggle. It does not shout, it does not defend, and it does not seek to be understood. It is the rebellion of awareness, a silent defiance that dismantles control simply by seeing it. Those who manipulate depend on your blindness, not your weakness. They thrive when you react, when you explain. When you defend yourself against distortions they have planted. But awareness removes the battlefield entirely. It replaces reaction with understanding, chaos with clarity, and fear with perception. To the narcissist, awareness is an invisible threat. It doesn't attack their mask, it simply sees through it. And once something is seen, it cannot hold the same power again. Awareness works in the quiet places, in the pauses before you respond, in the moments you recognize a manipulation, but choose not to engage, in the subtle act of observing rather than absorbing. It is not an act of resistance born from rage, it is resistance born from vision. The one who sees clearly can no longer be deceived, and the narcissist depends on deception as oxygen. They thrive on entanglement, on pulling you into a web of emotional confusion, where you begin to doubt your own perception. They twist truth into narratives that make you question your memory, your motives, your reality. Every argument becomes a maze, every conversation a trap, designed to provoke a reaction that reaffirms their control. But awareness dismantles this structure quietly. The moment you see the pattern, you no longer walk the maze, you step above it. You begin to perceive the manipulation not as a personal offense, but as a mechanical process, predictable and empty. This quiet seeing is what terrifies them most. Because awareness does not fight back, it simply withdraws energy from illusion. It refuses to feed the conflict that sustains their identity. When you remain calm, they lose direction. Their provocations fall flat. The more aware you become, the more they must escalate, trying harder to elicit a reaction. Anger, guilt, pity, anything to confirm that they still hold emotional power over you. And yet, your stillness reveals their desperation. They begin to sense that their influence is slipping, but they cannot name why. Awareness is not the same as detachment. Detachment can sometimes carry coldness or avoidance. Awareness carries warmth without enmeshment. It allows you to see the humanity beneath the manipulation while refusing to be consumed by it. You begin to understand that their cruelty is not power, but fear disguised as dominance. You see that every attempt to control is a plea for validation, a defense against their inner void. Awareness allows compassion without submission, boundaries without bitterness. You recognize their wounds without allowing those wounds to dictate your reality. This is where the silent defiance begins, in the space between stimulus and response. Before awareness, that space does not exist. You react automatically, pulled by emotion, hooked by provocation. After awareness, that space expands. You begin to see the trigger before it takes root. You can feel their manipulation as it approaches. A tone, a glance, a word shaped to test your emotional stability, and instead of reacting, you watch. You let the moment unfold, not as a victim, but as a witness. The power once held over you dissolves, not because you fought it, but because you refuse to animate it with your attention. To the narcissist, this quietness feels like defiance. They sense that something has changed, though they cannot articulate it. You are no longer predictable. You do not rise to their bait, nor do you retreat in submission. You simply remain present, aware, unshaken. This unnerves them because their entire strategy depends on emotional dominance. Without your participation, the illusion of control collapses. They may accuse you of being indifferent, detached, or uncaring, but beneath their accusations lies fear. The fear of no longer having power over your perception. Awareness transforms the dynamics of power completely. In unawareness, the narcissist dictates the emotional tone, deciding when you feel guilty, ashamed, or validated. In awareness, you reclaim authorship over your internal world. Their attempts to define your worth are met not with defense, but with clarity. You no longer seek approval from someone who profits from your insecurity. You begin to see that your peace is not a negotiation. It is your natural state once illusion falls away. The silent defiance of awareness is not a strategy, it is an awakening. You begin to see the difference between perception and projection. You realize that the accusations hurled at you are not reflections of your truth, but of their internal state. What once triggered pain now evokes understanding. What once created guilt now creates distance. This distance is not emotional coldness, it is the natural boundary formed by insight. When you see, you stop absorbing. You stop internalizing their shadows as your own. The narcissist's greatest weapon is confusion. They twist narratives to keep you disoriented, to keep you explaining, to keep you doubting yourself. Awareness dismantles confusion because it brings coherence. You start noticing patterns, how charm always precedes control, how praise turns to criticism once they feel you slipping away, how chaos always erupts when peace begins to settle. You no longer get lost in each episode because you recognize the cycle. Awareness turns repetition into revelation. Once you see the loop, you stop spinning inside it. This form of quiet seeing has immense psychological power. It breaks trauma bonds without confrontation. It returns energy to the self without declaring war. The narcissist cannot comprehend it because they interpret silence as defeat. But awareness is not silence of fear, it is silence of knowing. When you reach this level of understanding, their tactics begin to look small, almost mechanical, as though you're watching a play you've already seen too many times. What once consumed you now appears transparent, predictable, almost sad. Awareness is not about superiority, it is about vision. It is the light that reveals without burning. It does not need to punish the manipulator, for the truth itself is the punishment. Those who depend on lies cannot stand in truth's radiance for long. Awareness exposes not only them, but you. to yourself. You begin to see your own patterns of compliance, your own hunger for validation, your own fear of disconnection. This is the deeper gift of awareness. It does not merely protect you from others' darkness, it reveals your own. And in that revelation, something extraordinary happens. You stop participating in cycles of emotional exchange that drain your spirit. You no longer need to prove innocence to the accuser or goodness to the unkind. You no longer shift to earn belonging. Awareness becomes your quiet rebellion, the still force that neither attacks nor retreats, yet changes everything it touches. There is a quiet kind of power that unsettles those who live behind masks, the power of authenticity. It is not loud, it does not boast, and it does not demand recognition. Yet its very presence becomes a mirror in which falsehood cannot hide. Authenticity threatens not because it attacks, but because it exposes. It carries the vibration of truth, and truth has a way of undoing everything built upon illusion. To the narcissist, authenticity is not a virtue, it is danger. It reminds them of what they lost long ago, the capacity to be real without performance, to be seen without manipulation, to exist without needing an audience. Authenticity is not a performance of honesty. It is the alignment between one's inner world and outer expression, a life where words and feelings no longer contradict one another. For someone rooted in authenticity, there is no need to exaggerate, conceal, or control how others perceive them. They live from a core sense of truth that does not require validation. But to the narcissist, this state of inner coherence feels intolerable. It exposes the fragmentation of their own being. While the authentic person moves from a place of inner security, the narcissist's existence depends on external confirmation. They cannot feel whole unless they are reflected in the eyes of others. The narcissist's identity is a construction, a carefully arranged image assembled from admiration, envy, and fear. They wear it like armor, not to protect vulnerability, but to disguise the absence beneath it. Every interaction, every relationship, every word they speak serves to maintain the illusion that the mask is real. But authenticity carries a frequency that disturbs that illusion. It stands as living proof that another way of being exists, one that does not depend on deceit. This quiet example becomes intolerable because it evokes the shame they spend their lives suppressing. When an authentic person enters their world, the narcissist feels exposed without understanding why. Authenticity doesn't criticize, yet it makes lies vibrate with unease. It doesn't accuse, yet it makes manipulation visible. The narcissist senses this instinctively. They might admire the authentic person at first, drawn to their calm confidence, their emotional depth, their lack of need for validation. But soon admiration turns to envy, and envy to hostility. The same qualities that once attracted them become the very ones they must destroy, because those qualities reflect their own falseness. This is why authenticity often becomes a target. The narcissist cannot coexist with what reveals them. They may mock your sincerity, label you knave, accuse you of arrogance, or attempt to corrupt your integrity through subtle manipulation. Their goal is to pull you away from yourself, to make you question your reality. They will test your boundaries, distort your intentions, and provoke emotional confusion until you begin to doubt your own authenticity. To them, breaking your alignment is a form of victory, proof that truth can still be bent to their will. But authenticity, once awakened, does not easily die. Even when wounded, it remembers its source. It knows that truth is not something one performs, but something one is. The narcissist cannot comprehend this state because their entire existence revolves around performance. They mistake authenticity for strategy, vulnerability for weakness, compassion for control. When they encounter someone who does not react to manipulation, but instead responds with grounded honesty, it creates a rupture in their worldview. Their false self thrives on control, but authenticity is uncontrollable. It answers only to inner alignment, not external approval. In psychological terms, authenticity confronts the narcissist with their shadow, the dissound aspects of the self they refuse to acknowledge. Your ability to be genuine activates their buried sense of shame, the wound of inadequacy that once split their identity. Rather than integrate that pain, they externalize it. They project it onto you, making you the embodiment of what they cannot face. You become the enemy not because you harm them, but because your being reveals their pretense. This dynamic is why authentic people often find themselves misunderstood or targeted in relationships with narcissists. Their presence destabilizes the illusion of control. Their calmness is read as defiance, their honesty as rebellion, their boundaries as rejection. The narcissist cannot interpret authenticity through a healthy lens because they measure every interaction through dominance and submission. When you refuse to play, they perceive threat. When you remain transparent, they sense danger. The light of truth terrifies the false self because it cannot survive exposure. Authenticity is not loud or dramatic, it is deeply still. It does not need to convince anyone of its truth. It exists quietly, but its effect is profound. It changes the energetic landscape of every room it enters. In the presence of authenticity, pretense becomes heavy, words lose their disguise, and manipulation begins to falter. The narcissist feels this shift immediately. It's not what you say that threatens them, it's what you are. You represent a kind of freedom that contradicts their need for control. To live authentically among those who fear truth requires immense psychological strength. It means being willing to be disliked for being real. It means standing in your truth even when others misinterpret your silence, your boundaries, your refusal to play the game. The narcissist will attempt to rewrite your story to make you appear cold or cruel, but their words only reveal their projection. Authenticity does not fight for approval because it no longer needs to prove its worth. It finds peace in knowing that truth cannot be rewritten by perception. In relationships shaped by narcissism, authenticity often becomes a catalyst. It exposes the hidden imbalance and forces a choice. Either the narcissist must confront their own emptiness or distance themselves from the one who mirrors it. Most choose distance, retreating to environments where illusion can remain unchallenged. But for the authentic person, this separation is not loss, it is clarity. They do not need to punish or control because truth does not need vengeance. It simply stands unaltered by denial. Authenticity is threatening because it cannot be bought, flattered, or manipulated. It resists control by its very nature. It does not need an audience because its validation comes from within. The narcissist, dependent on admiration and reflection, cannot coexist with such self-sufficiency. To them, your stability feels like accusation, your peace feels like superiority, and your emotional independence feels like rejection. They will attempt to reclaim dominance by turning your authenticity into fault, by labeling your truth as coldness or your strength as cruelty. But their perception only reveals the limits of their understanding. Authenticity dismantles illusion simply by being itself. It brings the unspoken to the surface and reveals the difference between love and control, truth and manipulation, connection and performance. It does not need to prove anyone wrong. Its existence is proof enough. Light does not argue with darkness. It simply reveals it. Presence functions in the same way. It illuminates without confrontation, exposing what has been hidden not through aggression, but through clarity. The moment presence enters a space, confusion begins to dissolve. What was disguised by noise, distraction, or pretense starts to lose its form. Those who thrive on distortion sense this instinctively. To them, presence is not comfort, it is exposure. It reveals what their masks were meant to conceal. The emptiness beneath the performance, the shadow behind the charm, the wound beneath the control. Presence in its truest form is not an action but a state of being. It is the capacity to remain fully aware of oneself and one's surroundings without judgment or attachment. It carries the stillness of consciousness itself, quiet, observing, unbothered by appearance. To the narcissist, this stillness feels intolerable because it does not play into the game of emotional manipulation. Presence does not react, and reaction is the fuel on which narcissistic power depends. Without it, their constructed identity begins to flicker and fade. In a world built on psychological performance, presence becomes radical. Most people are caught between masks, the one they show to others and the one they wear for themselves. They are constantly editing their behavior to maintain approval, status, or belonging. But presence refuses to participate in this fragmentation. It is unity in motion, the alignment of thought, feeling, and action in a single, coherent awareness. When you embody that kind of inner coherence, you disrupt the invisible contracts that govern manipulation. You become light in a realm that prefers shadows. The narcissist survives through shadows, half-truths, distortions, and projections that blur reality. Their power lies in confusion. They know how to twist words, reframe memories, and seed doubt until the other person no longer trusts their own perception. It is not brute force that maintains their control, but disorientation. Presence dismantles this entirely. When you are aware, you see patterns instead of moments. You recognize emotional hooks for what they are. Bait designed to provoke reaction. The narcissist's strategies, once invisible, become almost predictable. The spell breaks not through confrontation, but through perception. This is the light of awareness, the light that does not chase darkness, but simply exists. It reveals motives without judgment, exposes lies without accusation, and transforms fear into understanding. Presence allows you to stand in the middle of manipulation without being consumed by it. You no longer interpret the narcissist's behavior as personal, you perceive it as projection. Their rage, charm, or silence no longer dictates your emotional rhythm because you are no longer anchored in their storm. You become the stillness in which the storm loses meaning. Presence does not destroy the narcissist, it renders their tactics irrelevant. Their patterns only work in the absence of awareness. Once light is introduced, the illusion begins to collapse. The narcissist depends on your emotional blindness to maintain their narrative. When you see clearly, you stop feeding that narrative. You no longer explain yourself because you understand that explanation is part of their control. You no longer defend your character because you realize their accusations are confessions in disguise. Awareness becomes your silent defense, one that cannot be manipulated or attacked. Psychological light exposes not only others' shadows, but also your own. It shows you the parts of yourself that once responded to manipulation, the insecurities, the longing for validation, the fear of abandonment. Presence brings these wounds into awareness, not to shame them, but to integrate them. When you see your patterns clearly, you stop replaying them unconsciously. The narcissist's control weakens not just because you understand them, but because you understand yourself. Their power was never over your body or mind. It was over your unexamined emotions. Light turns examination into liberation. In presence, everything slows. You begin to see the subtle manipulations that once rushed past you. The sudden changes in tone, the strategic use of silence, the calculated kindness before control. Awareness gives you the space to respond instead of react. Each breath becomes a pause where choice returns. You are no longer dragged into their emotional theater. You are watching from the balcony. The difference between the stage and the observer is light, the awareness that distinguishes reality from performance. Presence also transforms communication. When you speak from awareness, your words carry weight not because they dominate, but because they come from truth. You no longer speak to convince or defend, you speak to express clarity. This unnerves the narcissist, for they cannot manipulate clarity. They can only manipulate confusion. When your tone is calm, your body still, and your emotions unentangled, their tactics lose traction. Their provocations fall into silence, and in that silence, the emptiness of their performance becomes visible even to themselves. This is the paradox of presence. It disarms without confrontation. It neither attacks nor retreats, yet its effect is total. You are not trying to win, you are simply seeing. And in the act of seeing, the structure of manipulation collapses. Darkness cannot exist in the same space as light, not because light fights it, but because light renders it meaningless. Presence carries that same quality. It makes what is false irrelevant by anchoring you in what is real. Presence as psychological light also transforms perception of time. The narcissist's world operates on tension, the anxiety of control, the constant search for validation, the relentless push and pull of emotional dominance. But presence lives outside that tempo. It moves at the speed of awareness, which is timeless. When you are present, you no longer rush to fix, explain, or predict. You exist in direct experience where the narcissist's strategies have no access. Their entire structure depends on keeping you in past regret or future anxiety. Presence dissolves both. Light does not select what to reveal, it reveals everything equally. Presence functions in the same way. It illuminates both the manipulator and the manipulated, both the abuser and the wounded self. It does not take sides because it is beyond the duality of right and wrong. Its nature is to clarify, not to condemn. This neutrality is what makes it so powerful. It cannot be provoked, shamed, or deceived. In presence, truth simply becomes visible, and visibility itself changes everything. Presence exposes the psychological architecture of control, how it is built, how it feeds, and how it sustains itself through unconscious participation. Once that architecture is seen, it loses its ability to imprison. The narcissist's energy thrives in hiddenness. Awareness makes hiding impossible. What once appeared powerful now appears desperate. What once felt intimidating now feels small. Light does not conquer the dark, it simply ends the need for fear. In this illumination, awareness becomes both the teacher and the protection. It shows you not how to fight shadows, but how to stop mistaking them for substance. Presence, as psychological light, does not change others through force. It transforms the atmosphere by making truth undeniable.